11 CDL, maybe 2 qualifier matches, and we're breaking them all down now. Today is 213. I forgot to get the standings tweet, but I see CDL Intel's tweet, so I'll throw it at the end here. Alrighty. Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Let's do that again. Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3. Was there something wrong with it?
You sound different in Discord, but you sound fine on stream, so it's not. I was just wondering if I was messed up.
I don't know. Does it sound worse in Discord?
Yeah, it sounds worse in Discord, but it was fine when like we were talking before the stream.
So it still sounds bad like as I'm talking right now?
It's not. It's just different. Like you sound like super clear and low, and on stream and here it's like a little like louder and higher.
I don't know.
But it's all good. We're good.
All right.
Let me just check YouTube again. Yeah, YouTube's fine too. We're good.
Okay. You ready to get started?
Dessert.
Hello and welcome to episode 213 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are talking about the return of the Call of Duty League. The CDL Major 2 qualifiers have begun. The Week 1 matches have just finished a little bit ago. We're going to break them all down. I think there are some pretty interesting storylines, at least one in particular, that jumps out from these matches. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. Like you said, pretty eventful first week back in the online qualifiers, as we noted last episode, and I will try to do a good job of reminding everyone throughout these qualifiers. This is the first time we're doing this new format for Major 2 where every team is playing every other team, which means there are more matches this week. So we had 11 matches this week as opposed to 9 or 8 over the last couple qualifier weeks before Major 1. So a couple more matches, and naturally with a couple more matches there were some duds or just expected results, but there were also some unexpected upsets, and just like Preston said, a lot of stuff we can talk about from all this. So ready to jump right in.
Friday was the DoorDash day. It should have been sponsored. All three matches were 3-0 sweeps. I would not say very expected results necessarily. I think Optic beating Boston to start the week, to start the qualifiers, you can really see that, obviously. Optic defending world champions. They just went to the major grand finals. Even with how poorly they played to finish the major 1 qualifiers, you still would expect them to beat up on Boston, and they did. It wasn't like necessarily a super dominant performance in every single map, but a decisive win for Optic to start. Any overall thoughts from this match? Something that we both predicted and I think expected coming into this.
Yeah, definitely. A good sign from Optic to start off strong like this. We kind of joked on the last episode, or maybe it was 2 ago, about historically Boston being able to pull off an upset over Optic here or there, or Boston versus LAT last year too. Like just some weird times when you're not when you least expect Boston to do something. That's when they pull off an upset, and it would have been fitting if Boston somehow pulled this off. And maybe fitting is not the right word, but it's just, nobody was expecting Boston to win this match at all. And if they came out and did it, we would have had a very different tune starting off this episode. But yeah, I think this was, business as usual for Optic. Merck in particular played pretty well first two maps, and that's been the key for Optic a lot this year. I feel like is just when Merck is frying, they seem untouchable, and it doesn't even like I remember back. Um, During the major one qualifiers because it wasn't on land. And it was like one of the second or third matches they played on raid. He had like a double digit performance on raid S&D. It's like when it doesn't matter what mode it's in. If Merc is in that MVP form, like we both picked him to be the MVP coming into this year. If he's playing like that, Optic's really hard to beat. And this was a good example of that to start off these qualifiers.
Yeah, this series is basically what I expect from Optic, that maybe not every map is a dominant victory. That Overload in particular was pretty close, but they just have so much talent kind of budding out of this roster that unless you're a Vegas FaZe or Paris Gentlemates or LA Thieves or some other top team with a lot of talent, it's very hard to match them and keep them down for too long. And that's why it's always so surprising when Optic has these down moments or 3-4 weeks without winning a ton of matches, because it shouldn't happen with how much talent they have on this team. And that showed here. Mercules having a great map 1, then Shotzi has a great map 2, Dashy has a great map 3. That's really hard to beat, and especially if you're Boston, who they have, I think, a few good players, but certainly nobody at the level of Dashy when he is at his absolute best, Mercules when he's at his absolute best. Snoopy is obviously the closest to that, but I think Optic just has kind of like a few Snoopy-esque players on their team, and that makes them very hard to beat for anybody, but especially a team like Boston. Next up, though, we had Toronto versus Carolina, and I want to loop in Toronto's second match because I think this is one of the more interesting developments in the CDL this season. Toronto loses 3-0 on Friday to Carolina, who got absolutely slammed at the major after having a great end to the Major 1 qualifiers following their pickup from of Exceed to replace Slasher. And then Toronto on Saturday lose 3-0 to FaZe, who themselves had lost 3-0 on Friday. So a lot of things happening here, but I do want to hone in on Toronto. They lose all 6 maps this week, both matches, and we were looking up on the pre-show because we weren't exactly sure how long this losing streak was, but it is 7 matches in a row. They have not won a match in over a month. The last win that they picked up was on January 11th against LA Thieves. They won 3-0, and obviously that was part of a kind of a storyline that we were talking about, where LA Thieves had lost in pretty dominant fashion to Paris before the break, then they come back from break, and then they lose pretty dominantly to Toronto. But other than that, Toronto has not won a match. They lost 3-2 in the final week of the qualifiers before the break to Vegas. Then they have the break, they beat LAT, and since then they have lost to Carolina, Paris, Minnesota, Paris, Miami, and then obviously this week Carolina and Vegas. 3 of those losses have been sweeps, so nearly half of the losses in that streak have been without a map win. And now 7 straight losses. They are teetering toward the bottom of the CDL standings, if you can actually believe that, considering how much talent they have. And I think it's good to bring up the comment that the CEO of Toronto's parent company put out on Twitter after the matches this weekend. Adam Adamau, I think is how you say it, at Grazen on Twitter. He said, quote, "Not satisfied with where we are. Our fans expect more. Make no mistake, everything is under review, and we will do what it takes to get this back where it should be. Nothing more to say until there's something to say." I thought this was a little bit of dramatic, kind of phrasing about it, but this is obviously a huge problem considering we both lumped in Toronto as at minimum like a top 5 team coming into this season. You could argue that they were right there with, maybe you didn't believe in FaZe coming into the season. I think there were some pretty logical, I guess, like you didn't maybe expect them to be up there. But now Toronto is definitely not in that group. They can't be lumped into Optic, FaZe, Paris. I don't even know how far you might put them. But what do you think is going on with Toronto? Is a roster change necessary at this point before they get to the end of the qualifiers? You know, like we just said, they're playing 11 matches in these qualifiers. So waiting till the end of the qualifiers, waiting till after Major 2 could put them in a huge hole. So if you're kind of running the Toronto operation, what do you see and what do you feel like doing at that point?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, it really is kind of just like I feel like this happened out of nowhere. Just all these losses like piling up, and it's not a team that we've historically had to think about being in a position to really make like multiple roster changes potentially in the same season. Like you go back to the year after they had the 10-man roster and MW 2019, they brought in Insight to replace Methods, and then after that, it's replacing Bance, and there's somebody else in there that I'm skipping because obviously they got Scrap and Hixie in there, but regardless, it's been like small changes here and there, not
Yeah.
something like drastic where they are potentially on the verge of having to make multiple man change here if they don't you know figure something out right now. And I think it's a weird situation for Toronto because based on everything we heard in the offseason, they entered a bidding war for Real,
Mm-hmm.
and that in turn means they are most likely paying him a substantial amount of money, especially for a team like Toronto that, we've highlighted on the show multiple times how they do their business of letting their players explore restricted free agency every offseason, and they're doing stuff like that. So I don't even remember what Real's like leaked number was when we covered that leaked document, but um, based on everything we heard between like that going on, that situation of the bidding war between Toronto and Miami, Toronto seemingly invested quite a bit of money in Real, and Real has pretty substantially underperformed so far and
Mm-hmm.
in recent matches. And I don't want to put all the blame on him, but certainly this week, heading into these qualifiers, we hear about the role swap,
Yeah.
switching him to the flex and Kleenex on the sub. And, first map of these qualifiers, Kleenex was the only one positive on Toronto, I believe. He went 35 and 23, led the lobby in kills. Real goes 22 and 32. And again, I know it's, don't like to harp on stats and KD and all that stuff, but Real just had some pretty under pretty big underperformances at Major One in particular. I thought he really struggled. That's when it started to highlight for me that something might be going on. And then these two matches here, he's got a .8 KD in the Carolina match and a .84 in the phase match. Notably, they both weren't the lowest KD for each series. Joe actually had a .78 in the phase match for the lowest KD in the Toronto versus phase match, and then Insight had a .75 in the Carolina match, which was lower than Real's .8 against Carolina. So, even if you're one of those guys who's like strictly looking at the KDs, it's like you can't totally blame Real for each individual loss, but it just feels like, overall looking at it, Real has struggled lately. And that, I mean, I don't know how many like hardcore fans Real has, but I feel like we are two of the leading proponents of the Super Saiyan Real fan club over the years. We've done a good job hyping him up and highlighting his surge and in success from the start of the visa issues to joining Miami and then finally it clicking on that Miami team and how he was able to put himself in a position to even be like a highly touted free agent this upcoming year. Um, it's just really disheartening to see how um, all this it has unfolded really, and I don't know what the answer is because it feels like to me that would I mean we've talked about Insight before, and we've also talked about the AR
Mm-hmm.
like availability pool and stuff like that, so I don't know what the answer is there really. But if you got Real struggling on an SMG, you move him to the flex, and I know it's only been 2 matches on the flex, but it's obviously not, starting off super hot. It might be in a position where they have to make a tough call to bench Real because you're not going to just cut him if you're paying him a good amount of money, or you can try and send him to another team.
Yeah.
I don't know what his value is right now. Like his value would be super low on any trade market, and it's weird we don't even talk about that really from a Call of Duty perspective. But like
Hmm.
it would he would be the ultimate buy low candidate for some of these other teams who are
Yeah.
like, okay, we know what Real can be if he clicks and figures it out. It's just not working right now for Toronto. So yeah, it's really really tough. I you know I think highly of Joe. I mean, I think highly of all the guys on Toronto. Really, it's just whatever's going on right now, it is not working. And Toronto, just as a brand in Call of Duty, is too big of a name at this stage to allow this to continue without being a bit proactive and trying to flip the script on their season. So I really don't know what the answer is. I mean, they made it seem pretty apparent in the offseason that they're sticking to Joe and not letting him, go elsewhere or just explore his options. I don't know if that's the right way. I'm babbling a little bit, but it seems pretty clear they wanted to build around Joe. And it's not like this is the NFL or the NBA where they could, like, in theory, trade Joe for draft picks or compensation or something like that, and then just tank this year for a draft pick like that. That's not happening. So they got to try and do something to win matches now. And does trading Joe somehow open up an avenue for them to make other moves? It would be a weird thing to think about because it's just outside of like that um the formal for Octane trade and the gunless for, was it Clay? Yeah, gunless for Clay because it was supposed to be
Yeah.
gunless
It
for
was a
Attach. Like
swap.
there have only been, you can count the number of noteworthy quote unquote trades that have happened in Call
Yeah.
of Duty esports history on one hand. So um I'm not really sure what the answer is right now for Toronto. Something has to change because they got too much talent on this team for it to not click in this way. I mean, it might be a little dramatic to talk about it in terms of like they're on a losing streak playing against FaZe, but like you said, FaZe was coming off a loss against Miami that I was really stunned by. And then before that, Toronto plays Carolina. Carolina had looked strong online, and up until this, they were technically undefeated online with Exceed. So that was something we talked about last episode of like, are we going to see the Carolina that showed up at LAN? Or are we going to see a return for the Carolina that showed up online? I saw somebody even, maybe it was Attack Rab or somebody on Twitter was like calling Carolina the Royal Routers. And I saw Caroliners and a bunch of funny names for Carolina. So I don't know, you know, how much individual stock Toronto is going to put into these specific matches. But like you mentioned, 7 in a row, 0-6 map count this week after a role change. And they're not in a position where they got off to a strong start and they can, weather a couple of bad weeks to, still be in the champs race. Like they're in a position right now where the longer they let this fester, the deeper they're digging themselves in a hole if they want to end up back at champs. So really tough spot to be in for Toronto, and I wish I had a like definitive answer, but I mean the best I got right now is they gotta. I feel like as much as I like Real, I think it might be time to move on from him, but I just don't know how realistic that is from a business standpoint for Toronto.
Yeah, I also don't know how realistic all of this is, but like you said, we have seen from Toronto in the past that they really value being competitive in the CDL and that they're one of the teams that have been among the most reliably consistent as far as their CDL performance. Even last year when I think we both felt like they weren't a true championship contender. They were in a lot of top fours in the major. I think they finished fourth in the actual CDL standings at the end of the season. They have done like a really good job of identifying talent and being able to develop it over the years. Granted, there have been different regime changes. We've had Marky B and Mayhem and all of them, and now it's a different kind of era in Toronto. But at the same point, like they've been very good at that. I just, like I said at the top, I really just don't know how long they can afford to wait on something like this. And I'm not saying that it necessarily has to be a Real trade, or if it has to be something like. I obviously think that in a perfect world, they would have been able to replace Insight over the offseason and upgrade at the AR position, and then maybe some of these things, some of the problems that we're seeing now are kind of papered over because they have a ghosty like figure at the AR, where it's just there's so much talent, so much more talent there, that it can kind of be papered over. But obviously that isn't the case, and Insight hasn't been the major issue. It has been Real, in a lot of these matches. And I agree with you. They have a problem because of the meta. They have, if this was a 3 sub 1 AR meta, they would be probably in a lot better position, but they have 3 SMGs, and the meta is not necessarily in that position, at least not consistently enough for them to do that. And I think that is a major problem. I think Real could be underperforming, even though he was in a sub role until this week. He could just be underperforming because this is a new team, new teammates. Obviously, he had a lot of success with the Miami guys, but if you look at that Miami roster, especially the one they finished the season with, they had Rincor and Super, 2 like very high level AR players. Like I think Rincor has obviously we say KD isn't everything, but I think he has one of the highest KDs in the league so far this season, and he's been performing very, very well. At the same point, Toronto is not that. They have one too many SMG players, and that creates kind of a big issue for them. They don't have a true flex, which is just, we've talked about it before, but like that's a really underrated part of a roster, and when you don't have it, it is really damning, and it really affects you. I think obviously Draza would probably be like the perfect guy to come in if that could happen. Draza try to erase Scrappy's legacy with Toronto or something, but obviously FaZe is the team that you look at just because they already have an AR sitting on the bench, unlike a lot of other teams. So that they could afford to part ways with one of their ARs if things were to kind of go down a little bit. And we did see FaZe lose this week. So I would make a call to FaZe to see what they might want to do, and maybe it is Joe getting traded, or obviously that would not be ideal. I think you would want to trade Real if you could, because Joe and Kleenex are certainly the better 2 SMGs so far this season, but they also just have to kind of make do with what they have. And if they can't send Real out and get a suitable AR to replace him, but they can send Joe Deceives out and get a suitable AR to replace him, then they might actually have to make that move and kind of suck it up along the way. I don't know. And we don't know Joe's contract. That's also another thing. Like maybe it's up after this year, and maybe they're not super confident they can re-sign him. So it's kind of like, let's get something back for him while we can before he walks in the offseason. So there are a lot of variables, and we're taking that all in, but at the same time, like they're at a super low point, and they're undoubtedly one of the worst teams in the CDL at this point in the season.
So one thing I don't remember if we actually discussed it or not, because it's a little weird. I don't think it was actually officially announced, but neither was Neum when that whole thing went on with Neum for LAT in the sub. But there have been rumblings before this weekend matches that Kips from Huntsman was being targeted / signed by Toronto, and then it was that he's potentially being looked at as a sub. Given that we got a Twitter announcement from Toronto about a role change, I don't know how official the Kips situation with Toronto would be,
Mm-hmm.
because that feels like it would be um, a pretty straightforward tweet given the role change tweet. But at the same time, like I said, LAT never announced anything when Neum was reportedly, allegedly uh, a sub. So
Yeah.
maybe it's a situation where Huntsman is doing a similar like loan type contract with Toronto, and like Toronto now has the option to add Kips to the starting roster at some point during these qualifiers, and if they don't, he's the loan deal is done or whatever. Um, so that's one thing to keep an eye on there. As far as I know, he's either an AR or a flex player, because I think the rumors were Kips for insight, but that's it's been a little bit of time, and I'm saying this off the top of my head without looking at anything right now, so I don't know. Don't take my word 100% on that. Um, the other thing I just thought about after you said Draza, and it got me thinking about it, that this might be a little bit of a hot take, or might seem like it's coming out of nowhere. One name potentially Toronto could look at right now is Kenny, and I don't know if that would really move the needle. Maybe it's a case where
Mm-hmm.
Kenny just need to change the scenery, and somehow, going to Toronto fixes things for him. But at least from a financial standpoint and all that stuff, he is, as far as we know, he's up for grabs right now for free. And
Mm-hmm.
I think Kenny did put out something that he got a call from C9 over this off season, or little like break after Major One, after he was released, and that was it. And obviously Kenny wasn't going to go to C9 because of the whole uh, reported contract situation there. But I'm pretty sure if I went back in the notes from the off season, there was a point where the reported interested targets for Toronto were Joe, Draza, and Kenny, and it was either all three of them at the same time or at different points. I don't really remember, but that was definitely, like, I remember pretty clearly that those three names were attached to one another during the off season at different points. And maybe if, tinfoil hat a little bit here, if this whole thing with Toronto is wanting to build around Joe, maybe Joe wanted to play with Kenny entering the season. Now Kenny is available. Maybe Joe wants to play with him now. It would be, just given the actual in-game performance of Kenny this year, it would be a very interesting move by
Mm-hmm.
Toronto that
Yeah.
a struggling team brings him in here. But like I said, maybe it's just they just need to switch something up, and this could be the spark. I mean, there's not many former world champions who just become free agents this early in the offseason are technically up for grabs. So, yeah, you mentioned Draza as a name there, and that got me thinking about Kenny. So, I mean, there's seemingly options for Toronto when, just a couple weeks ago and whatnot, we were talking about maybe not having as many options. So, I'm not sure what Toronto will do, and I don't think you are either, but seems like there are potential avenues here to make a change that could, right the ship for the squad.
Yeah. I don't think it would work, but it is also a
Yeah.
role issue, and he does, in some respect, fix that role issue, or you would think he would fix it. It's just he's, like you said, he hasn't performed well, and that's frustrating, I'm sure, for him. I did see him say on stream that that he likes this game and that he wants to continue to compete. So it doesn't seem like he's ready to retire. But I also think, and I know from other players and other world championship great players, that sometimes that decision is made for you and you don't really make that decision yourself. It's an unfortunate reality, but I don't know if he gets another chance in the CDL. I don't. Speaking of Kenny, I don't know if he has a desire to go down to challengers and do what some of these other former CDL players have done and kind of rehab their reputation, so to speak, and then move back up when the reputation has been kind of rehabilitated. But yeah, I don't know. Toronto, they're just not in a good position. They don't have a lot of great options, and we even talked about that in the offseason, that that trio of Real and Joe and Kleenex, that's a really good trio, but at the same point, I did not know if they were actually going to be that good of a team. And I was, putting it on insight, of course, but I think it just comes down to like maybe this roster doesn't really fit together, and that's something that we often as a community overlook. In terms of like they have some good names, they have a lot of talent, but how well do they actually play together on the map is something that you can't really know until they actually get out there and do it. And unfortunately for Toronto, they have not been doing that very well at all. So yeah, they lose both of their matches 3-0 to Carolina and 3-0 to FaZe. Any specific thoughts on either of these matches before we move on to FaZe's first match of the week?
What
Did
are
you
you talking about now?
did I cut out?
No, I just like I thought you said something about phase and then you said before phase.
Okay, I was just saying. Do you have anything on Toronto's matches in
Oh,
particular before we move
I
on?
missed the Toronto part.
Yeah.
That's on me. I was, um, no, I don't. I think the only thing we didn't really highlight was that it was actually a 100-point comeback for Carolina in the first map of the Toronto series. Toronto was up 120-14 at one point in map one of their first series. So I guess technically, if you're, looking for something to be a little optimistic on, it, Toronto did have a decent start at least, but after that, it was pretty much all Carolina. And yeah, the Toronto versus FaZe match, I think that one could have got a little, been if Toronto was able to cause some damage there, it would have made a little more sense. Granted, or given just FaZe's performance before that, which we're about to get into. But yeah, I think you know. 0-6 map count is what it is. It's got to be tough if you're a Toronto fan, and we're just gonna have to see what comes next.
FaZe, they had 2 3-0s this week. It's just that they lost 1-3-0 and won the other. The first match, so they beat Toronto in their second match of the week. Their first, they play Miami to finish out Friday, and it was an absolutely dominant hardpoint win for the Heretics to start 250 to 132. And then about as close as you can get in the next two maps. This was an all-scar series, which I saw there was some discussion about the CDL and all like basically like exposure and scar like we just saw with these last two series. Not Optic and Boston, but Toronto and Carolina. Exposure 3 times, Miami versus FaZe, scar 3 times. So I saw some discussion about that. But either way, FaZe loses all 3 maps. The final 2, round 11, S&D, they lose 4-3 in overtime, scar overload. So there's a lot of kind of moral victories there, but when you're FaZe, I'm sure there's really not very many moral victories that you're willing to take away from this. What did you think of this performance, which I think you said in the pre-show didn't make any sense?
I just did not see this coming at all. Was super shocked. I mean, we've talked about it with other matches and other teams. At one point, it was a round 11 search and overtime in the overload, so they were close. Maps 2 and 3. Map 1 was just pure dominance from Miami. Definitely wasn't expecting that. But this was, again, we don't want to harp on the numbers, but it feels like the only real way to break this down is you got Super dropping a 1.67, Trakes dropping a 1.33, and Simp, Draza, and O4 all dropping point sevens for FaZe. Simp
Mm-hmm.
with a 0.76. That might be one of the lowest KDs I've ever had him see in an individual series. I'm sure somebody could actually fact check that if they wanted to, but he was the KD leader for the Major 1 qualifiers and starts the Major 2 qualifiers with a dud. That just isn't really what you expect from Simp historically or after setting the bar with him leading the KDs in the Major 1 qualifier. So really, I was really speechless. I mean, I didn't even put too much in the notes for this one because I watched it and I felt like an out of body experience. I was just like, what did I just didn't see it coming. I had no idea how this happened, but it did. And I mean, each individual map in this series, Super and Trakes, they have the best individual numbers per map, and they have the best statistics for the series overall as a result. So I did for Miami's second map. I put something down about Trakes that we can talk about later. But this was probably Trakes' best total series so far. I mean, a 1.33 is pretty noteworthy from anybody, even if you had a teammate
Mhm.
with a 1.67 ahead of you. 1.33 still pretty good job. So um, maybe this is the start of the Trakes Rookie of the Year campaign, and that's the best way to look at it. I don't know.
Yeah, Miami. How I kind of view this is, granted, they're gonna have to play everybody, so it's not like you might only play 5 matches and you're playing the 5 best teams or whatever. At least you're playing the full league, and you get kind of a like an even split with good teams and great teams and not some good teams. But this week, Miami, they played FaZe and Paris. That's about as hard of a 2 match schedule as you can get. And for them to go 1-1 this week, obviously we'll talk about the Paris match in a little bit. But for them to go 1-1 this week is incredible, and that is why this is so important for them, and how well Super played. Which, he has not had like the greatest season, obviously, after a Rookie of the Year like esque kind of campaign last year. But he played lights out. Like you said, Trakes had possibly his best series of the season, and I think we've said that a little more often as of late, which is always good to see, because it didn't start off necessarily great. Yeah, and then Simp, he had probably his worst series of the season, and when those two things collide, it gets a 3-0 win for Miami, and a much needed win for the Heretics going into the end of the week.
I'm not going to speculate too much on this, but it is, maybe, maybe this is a case where I mean, it's not like FaZe is coming off a championship, so I don't know why this could potentially be a thing, but maybe this was just a case where FaZe were completely overlooking how difficult this match might have been to kick off the qualifiers. Maybe they were feet kicked back a little bit and just like, all right, we got Miami to start, smooth sailing, get a nice win to kick off the qualifiers. But I would be shocked if they were like underestimating that much. I really, like I said, and like you just said at the end there, it's weird to think about any other logical explanations for this outside of the actual performances that we got. And might be a case where the numbers don't lie, and you got a 1.67 and a 1.33 KD versus 3.7s. A 3.0 isn't the craziest thing in the world.
Yeah, but we have seen, even if you go back at the beginning of or after the break, when Paris played the Falcons and they looked like they were cruising to a win, and we were talking about how Sib kind of looked like he was kicking his feet back during the S&D, and then it flipped, and the Falcons take the rest of that series. Granted, we don't know exactly what is going on in these players' mind. Maybe it isn't that they're taking them lightly, but I don't think it's too crazy to say that it could happen, especially with a team like Miami, who hasn't had a very strong season to this point. They've kind of been up and down more, especially against some of the top teams. They've been more down than up. So yeah, FaZe has had kind of a good track record in general with a lot of teams. But if you look back at last year, Miami was very competitive with FaZe, especially after the Super signing. And if Trakes is able to kind of meet the level of Rancor and Super like on a consistent basis, this team is exactly what what we thought they could be, and that's like a top 5, top 6 team like they were last year, where like when you play LAT or Optic or FaZe or whatever, those teams are on high alert. They know that they can lose that series very easily to the Heretics. Even we'll talk about when they play Paris, like it's a little bit different. I think they are a good team, but just inconsistent, and sometimes that inconsistency can really surprise teams, and I think that's what happened here against FaZe, especially in map 1. Like it's very rare to see FaZe get absolutely dominated like that. We did then go to Saturday, February 14th, Valentine's Day. Or what?
You want to just loop in Toronto versus FaZe real quick, since we already kind of talked about it?
Yeah, let's do it. So FaZe, obviously they lose 3-0 on Friday to Miami. And then on Saturday, like we talked about with Toronto, their last match, FaZe then wins 3-0. This was a much more kind of straightforward. It was pretty decisive wins for FaZe across the board. I think this, obviously we talked about how poorly Toronto has played as of late, but this kind of continues the trend of FaZe dominating or at least beating the teams that we considered to be like in that top echelon of the league early in the season, where they started off and just absolutely were obliterating teams. But yeah, this is a 3-0 win for FaZe. Did you see any differences between this match and the Miami match, or was, I guess, the Miami match more just an anomaly from your point of view?
That's really how I view it. Is like that's why I was super speechless after the fact. Like if Toronto put up more of a fight against FaZe, I would have been much more concerned with that plus the Miami matchup. But pretty convincing series for FaZe, and we've talked about this enough, so I don't think we need to spend too much time on it. But
Mm-hmm.
my big takeaway is, especially in a qualifiers where you're playing every other team, that means there's more matches, and that also means there is, I don't know if it's statistically correct, but just because there are more matches, there are more potential final record outcomes. So it might be
Yeah.
possible that it's harder to tie,
Oh,
but it
definitely.
also might mean that there are more teams that are grouped, especially if there's not like a super dominant team at the top and a super, like 11 and 0 and 0 and 11. Like if there's a bunch of wins being spread out, I feel like it's going to be some close records with in terms of tiebreakers, and especially for FaZe having that 0-3 loss against Miami. The 3-0 win over Toronto is like twofold important in my eyes, because it gets their map count to 3-3, which they already, with any team that loses 0-3 in a potential tiebreaker that comes down to map count, like you're already like, putting yourself on a back foot, because even a 3-1 loss is better than a 3-0 loss in that
Mm-hmm.
sense. But with the way Toronto have been playing, if they don't like very quickly correct course and improve, we're looking at a situation here where Toronto is going to be like, it's kind of like we were looking at Vancouver. It never really came to this. I just remember talking about it when it was like the three-way tie for the 1 seed potentially, going into the last week of the Major One qualifiers, and FaZe was playing Vancouver, and I was like, FaZe has the best opportunity to get a 3-0 win, which would set them up for the best map count to potentially get the first seed. Didn't end up mattering in that sense, but with the way Toronto has been playing, they now have that 0-6 map count. That means two teams have 3-0'd them, and other teams that will be playing up against Toronto now, that puts a little more pressure on them to try to also get a 3-0 victory in case of these tiebreaker scenarios shaking out in a way where you don't, with the way Toronto's played, you don't want to be that team that's like, I got a 4-3, or 4-3 would be the 7 matches, so I got a 6-5 record, but we only beat Toronto 3-2, and then
Mm-hmm.
another team has a 6-5 record. They beat Toronto 3-0, and they get like the last winners bracket spot, which, yeah, I don't. That's weird. It's also a different format for this major and stuff, so I could be just ranting, uselessly babbling about it. But that's where my mind is at right now with the 0-3 and the 3-0 win slash loss for FaZe. Having a 3-3 map count isn't like the best scenario, because obviously 6-0 map count after 2 matches is the best, and then even if you're a 1-1 record, you would want to have like a 5-3. Well, 5-3 would be, yeah, 2-3 loss and a 3-0 win. So that's the best outcome you would hope for if you go 1-1 in a week, and
Mm-hmm.
phases 2 map wins behind that because of the 3-0 loss. So might be getting ahead of ourselves, but that's something I thought about when I was thinking of these matches. So I wanted to get it out there.
No, I think it makes sense. Like you said, there are going to be fewer tiebreak situations just in general because there's 11 matches and some of these teams will just have a different split. Like when we have, say, 5 matches, like, that's pretty realistic that a bunch of teams are going to be 2-3 or 3-2, and there's just going to be a shit ton of tiebreakers down the line, either way. But, when there are 11 matches, like, and even if there's a tie between two teams, because they all played each other that will be solved by the head-to-head tiebreaker. So whoever won that
Yeah.
match, it's really when it gets to those multi-team, the three teams, really that tie. I think that really will kind of shake some things up. And I think one of the underrated parts of this is obviously you don't want to be in the bottom two at the end of the qualifiers because you won't go to major two. But you really don't want to be in the 7 through 10 either because you'll be in that play-in bracket. And I wouldn't want to be in that play-in bracket. I want my security in the winners bracket and just starting out in the tournament without having to kind of fight my way in to the bracket. So I think it's Toronto is undoubtedly, in my opinion, one of the bottom three teams right now, like where the three teams are C9, Toronto, and Vancouver, where it's like those teams seem the most at risk of either not going to the major or being like that ninth or 10th seed where they're in like a really vulnerable position as soon as they get over to England. So, Toronto is in a really bad way. FaZe, I think, obviously, this is a big win for them because I'm sure they were probably expecting that they would go 2-0 this week and that they would start off undefeated. And obviously, that just didn't happen. But this is a good win, a good bounce back. I think it's basically what you might expect of these two teams at this specific point in the season where Toronto is spiraling and FaZe is, a top 3 or 4 team at minimum. So pretty expected performance from them. I want to move on, though, to Paris, and we'll loop in both their matches as well because they had a 2-match week. First, on Saturday, February 14th, they started with the Riyadh Falcons, who upset them in the Major 1 qualifiers. We just talked about it a little bit ago. Paris had won the first map very, very convincingly. They looked like they were going to win map 2 very convincingly, and then the Falcons made a comeback on map 2 and then won map 3 and map 4 to win that series. And that kind of started, I think, at that point, like Paris looked a little bit more vulnerable than we had seen them previously, even though they did lose to FaZe in a game 5. Like, that's a very understandable loss, but they were going to like game 4 or 5 against C9, who just looked awful, and they were playing Falcons, who had looked kind of bumbling to start the qualifiers. But then Paris finishes the Major 1 with a championship, and then none of that matters, right? Like, that all kind of disappears, and we talked about them, and they're undoubtedly the best team in the game. Then they come into this match, and the Falcons immediately win map 1. They make a comeback, Colossus Hardpoint. They win 250-194, and then Paris wins convincingly on S&D. A really, really tough overload win for Paris. And then you might think, okay, well, Falcons made that big comeback on map 1. Nope, 100-point club, Paris, 250-93. Get them out of here. I think this showed pretty much like everything that we have seen of Paris to this point in the season, where it's a whole lot of good. Some things where you're like, that is not quite right. I don't know what happened there, and then it turns out all right in the end. Is that how you felt about this performance from the Paris Gentlemates?
Yeah, I mean, really, the juxtaposition of the two hard points was really what stood out to me, and I think he did a good job describing that in the sense of we see another. I mean, this was 200-point comebacks in map 1s of 2 of the first 4 map 1s that we saw this weekend. So it was a strong performance for Falcons to pull that one off, and Xnid led the way at 40. We've talked about Xnid multiple times on this podcast and whether he's the right guy for Falcons and whatnot. And I think, you can still have your opinions on that, but I think we both said it in recent episodes, and I'll say it again here. It feels like Xnid is starting to play a little bit better and have some of these truly standout performances when a lot of people might not expect that from him. So wanted to at least give Xnid a shout out for the 40 bomb in that map 1. But yeah, I mean, especially like you said, they pull off a comeback, and they being Falcons pull off a comeback in map 1. Strong S&D from Gentlemates, and then an OT win through kills in the overload. Go to a map 4 hard point. You're like, okay, maybe this will be another back and forth hard point, and no, it's just a 100-point club. Pred goes almost triple negative, 13 and 29, so triple negative is harsh, but over double negative in in the 100 point club loss for Falcons, and Ghosty, Envoy, Neptune all had at least 28 kills. So it was a pretty big slaying difference. If not even having to add up the numbers. Sib had 15 kills in uh, the map 4, and it didn't even matter. So, um, yeah, I think this was probably a uh, a feel good win for Gentlemates, not only in the sense of it coming after their Major 1 victory, but also coming up against a team that they did lose to in the Major 1 qualifiers. Like, just hadn't. I think I said it in terms of from a Falcons perspective, like they could go into a match against Gentlemates later this season after that being like, okay, we beat these guys, we know we can beat them.
Mm-hmm.
Now Gentlemates have that feeling as well. It's like one of the teams that did beat them before they won a championship. They're like, okay, we can move on from that, and we're on to the next. So I thought maybe that's looking at it a little too deep, but nonetheless a strong start for the Major 1 champions and the Major 2 qualifiers.
Yeah, and then on Sunday they beat Miami to start the day 3-1. Very close hard points both, especially the first one, 250, 224. Miami ends up taking the S&D to tie up the series, but then Paris wins another close overload, 2-1, and then win 250, 172 on Den hardpoint. So 2-0 start for the defending major champions against, I would consider, like some pretty stiff competition. Like Falcons have looked a little bit iffy at points, especially recently. But Miami, we had just seen the 3-0'd phase earlier in the week. How good or how confident, I guess, are you feeling about Paris? Because, we saw them at Major 1. They get 3-0'd by Optic in the winners finals. So there's obviously some like, oh shit, like something's going on here. Optic is making this run through the winners bracket. Then they get to the grand finals. We talked about, I believe their S&D was kind of on point. I think it was S&D was on point in the grand finals, and they're able to win the grand finals, of course. And then here they win, or they lose the S&D to Miami. They lose that opening hard point to Falcons. I think you can, if you want to be disingenuous, you could always be like, well, they're losing maps in both hardpoint and S&D, the two most important game modes, but it doesn't seem like they have like one real weakness. It just seems like they're not nearly as strong as they maybe could be at the end of the season. So how are you feeling about Paris just in general, in context of this Miami match?
Yeah, so I think, especially given what happened between Miami and FaZe, I was looking at this as maybe an opportunity for Miami to showcase to us or to everyone watching that they have improved since the whole stuff early in the season with the visa issues and
Mm-hmm.
potential lack of practice, yada yada. I do think it is a little noteworthy. Like you mentioned, Gentlemates did play well in the searches in the grand finals against Optic, but I think you and I and many others would consider, especially the type of people on this team and so far, would consider them to probably be long term a better respawn team than an S&D team, even though they have shown the ability
Mm-hmm.
to win through both avenues. But at the same time, we have seen Miami, especially at the end of last year, be a really strong search and destroy team. So the fact Miami was able to win a search here, you don't want to, you know, talk about moral victories or anything, but it's a search and destroy win against the Major 1 champs, so it's not non noteworthy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the end of the day, I think Gentlemates are clearing away the best team in the game right now, and I don't think you can really argue that just because they are the Major 1 champs and nobody has beaten them since then. I will be excited to see Paris versus Optic when that happens in these qualifiers because it'll be a nice rematch, and I think a lot of people will be excited for that one. But team we haven't talked about directly yet is LAT, the other team that went undefeated this week in the qualifiers, and they got the new guy Neum on the squad. So that's going to be an interesting match to see, and I would be excited for Paris versus Gentlemates, but now after the Paris versus Miami match, I don't know if I would even pick FaZe to beat Gentlemates this time around, just because of who knows what's going on right there. So interesting spot to be in. I think it's a you know good start for Gentlemates nonetheless. But from Miami perspective, I think a 1-1 week, given the teams they played and a 4-3 map count in this week, it puts Miami in a pretty solid place, in terms of potential tiebreakers and stuff.
Yeah, I definitely think Paris is number one in the league with a bullet. Miami is a lot harder to place because they've had some pretty good performances against some pretty good teams, and then they have not looked good against some other teams. We were talking about in the pre-show that we forgot about the power rankings after Major One, but I think the plan is that we're going to do power rankings on the next show on Tuesday or Wednesday. And I have no idea where I'm going to put Miami. Like, I don't know what tier they actually kind of slot into at this point in the year, but we'll kind of cross that bridge when we get to it. I do want to talk about Falcons more though, because they lose this match to Paris. That's one of the matches that you expect them to lose, and that's why it was so surprising when they beat them in the Major One qualifiers. But then they played Boston on Sunday, and they lose 3-1 in that series, and you're like, okay, you can lose to Paris, you cannot lose to Boston and expect us to keep talking about you as kind of like not like a contender, but like trying to break into that top tier. Like they have not proven it to this point. They had like a really good stretch toward the end of the Major One qualifiers. They won 5 straight matches, but between the major and these 2 matches, but specifically this loss to Boston, I think that is pretty worrisome for Vegas. And I kind of want to touch base with you because we talked about in the last episode about how Kismet had said he's still not comfortable on the AR. He's an SMG player who's playing out of role. We just had a long conversation about something just like this with Toronto, where they have guys that are playing out of role and they're switching things around because I would assume the guys aren't comfortable or they're just not performing up to the standard that they would want. But this makes 4 losses in their last 5 matches for Falcons. Granted, those losses are to Optic, Vegas, Paris, and then Boston. So the 4 juggernauts of the CDL, their only win in that span was to C9. That was the losers round 1 match of Major 1. What do you think Vegas should do? Is a roster change on the horizon? How do you kind of approach this when they performed very, very well? They tied for first seed in the Major 1 qualifiers, but over Major 1 and now to start Major 2 qualifiers, they have not looked anywhere close to that.
I mean, maybe this is the Falcons thing this year where they start 0-2 in the qualifiers and just win
That's
out.
true.
So Falcons might go 9-2.
Yeah.
But on a more serious note, I do think it is, a way of looking at it in the sense of the Gentlemates loss. Yeah, you can, chalk that up, even though we did mention like they have the experience against them playing well earlier in the season. The Boston series, I'm pretty sure Falcons won 3-2 when they played earlier this year, so it
Believe
was a
so.
close series. Um, so I don't know. I don't think I'm pressing the panic button for Falcons 2 yet. I mean, it is. I'm glad you did bring up the Kismet comments and stuff again, just in the sense of keeping that fresh, and it will be something to keep an eye on moving forward. But I don't expect Falcons to make a change like after this match in particular. But it
Mm-hmm.
is, admittedly, I do think it's a little concerning for them to lose this one to Boston, especially like the way Optic seemingly like manhandled Boston. I mean that's comparing Optic to Falcons, which isn't really fair either. But um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Cammy seemed to play pretty well in this series in particular. Another series that where we have a round 11 search, so maybe that goes differently. Falcons are up 2-0 in this series.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but Cammy drops 12 in the S&D, drops 36 in the map 4. So maybe Killer Cam is turning back the clock to Cold War a little bit. Not really sure. The one thing from this series though that stood out to me, and I I put in the notes. It makes sense given the team he was on previously and seemingly them always beating Boston, but Before this, Celium was 15-1 in his career against Boston, and his last match that he lost to Boston was in 2022. This is according to at Money Hill Stats on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean that would make a lot of sense considering. Yeah, FaZe is not one of those teams that had a ton of problems with Boston. They typically had trouble with like Optic at certain points or LAT, not the Boston breach of all teams. But yeah, I this is a pretty bad loss. I don't think that Falcons should have too much of an issue qualifying. I don't see them being in the bottom two of the qualifier standings at the end of this, but seeding matters obviously, and they don't want to have to play round one against FaZe or whoever like they did in Major One where they dropped down. Like they think they played Optic round one, right, and then they instantly dropped down, and then they played C9 and then they got bounced from the tournament. Like that's obviously not what you want for your team. I hope, like we said on the last episode, that Kismet's able to kind of turn things around and become like a solid AR player because, personally, I just think like that would be cool. But also like his team definitely needs that, as a lot of teams do. They need, their one of their AR players to be solid and consistent, and that just hasn't been the case this season. And that kind of leads to a letdown against Boston. And we've seen that plenty of times over the years that when teams kind of have like a weakness or just like some kind of vulnerability, Boston is able to exploit that. It's just they don't always do it. They kind of pick and choose their spots, and unfortunately for the Falcons, this was their spot, and Boston gets a pretty big win for their qualifier standings as well. Let's jump back to Saturday, though. The second match, Optic versus G2, probably the most competitive, entertaining match of the entire weekend, which isn't that surprising because both of these two teams went to a Game 5 early in the Major 1 qualifiers when Minnesota was pretty much going to Game 5 and losing to most of those teams. And Optic started off very, very strong. And they go to another Game 5 here. G2, they go up 2-0 in the series. Pretty decisive hardpoint win. Then they win 6-4 S&D. And then Optic starts their comeback, 3-1 overload, 250-221 hardpoint. And then they go to round 11 on Raid S&D, and Optic gets the win. How much, or I guess kind of what are you looking at in terms of this match? Because G2 has been one of the most pleasant surprises of this entire season to this point. They have proven to be not only competitive, but very capable of beating top teams, including FaZe Vegas twice so far this year. Optic has looked very up and down. They've nearly won Major 1, but they also had a losing streak to end the qualifiers. So how do you kind of see this match, a 3-2 win for Optic?
Yeah, I mean, not to, you know, single one individual moment in the series out, but it's going to sound weird when I say it, but the map 2, which G2 wins 6-4, G2 is up 5-0, and for an S&D guy like me, any opportunity where a full sale of a team being down 0-5 to a 6-5 win, any opportunity where that gets remotely close, it immediately gets the wheels turning for me in my head and gets me to start thinking about it. And it has happened twice now in at Major 1. It happened with Toronto, almost did it in Game 5 against Miami in the loser bracket. So like it was almost a Game 5 full sale for Toronto to stay in the tournament. And now this happens here, so that's like two full sales almost, two almost full sales in roughly 2 weeks. And both of them ended 6-4, so they didn't quite get there, but it's like, it's almost getting to that point. Um, so that really stood out to me here, but it also, in the context of this series, it's like G2's up 5-0 in the search in Game 2 after winning map 1. If they close out that search 6-0, 6-1, 6-2, maybe they really just have more momentum going into the overload to close out this series. But it's the fact that, again, and we've talked about whether momentum and all that is actually a big deal multiple times now. But the fact Optic were able to string together 4 rounds in a row when being down 5-0 in that Game 2, it might not matter for the game to score or outcome, but maybe that was just enough for Optic to like get it, get in a little bit of a groove and propel them to winning the next three maps. And that could be being over dramatic or
No,
looking
I don't
too
think so.
far into it too. Um, but that's what stood out to me at least. And it is. I think we've talked about Minnesota now last couple of years with their game fives. This is another game five, round 11. Last year, it felt like they were the team that was forcing the game fives, and they weren't able to close it out after pulling off some reverse sweeps early in the year, or maybe it was just a couple. I'm not right. My mind's melted a little bit when it comes back to the whole Minnesota saga last year with their game fives. But um, the fact Optic were able to pull off a reverse sweep here against a team that like you said, that they did beat them at the major, but it's a team in G2 that has, at points so far this year, they went from being a sneaky squad coming out of the preseason to having higher expectations to then being a squad that struggled a little bit early in the major one qualifiers, and it was like, okay, maybe the preseason didn't matter, to then a team that looked stronger again, or looked more in line with that preseason form at the end of the major one qualifiers and at the start of major one itself. And now we get a showing here with where, end of the day, it's a 3-2 loss to Optic. And going back to the tiebreakers and whatnot we talked about with FaZe, like, if you're going to lose to a team like Optic, it is much better to lose 3-2 to them than it is to lose 3-0.
Yeah.
So it sucks for G2 to be in a position where they potentially could have closed this out and caused the major upset. Um, but end of the day, it's a good sign for the Green Wall, obviously, that the squad was able to stay resilient and pull off a reverse sweep here. If I had to guess, this would be Optic's first reverse sweep of the year, because I can't think of any others. But um, also worth mentioning that Shotzi had the lowest KD in the series with a .76, and Optic was still able to win. Like, that's noteworthy in itself, in the
Yep.
sense of, for what Shotzi means to Optic, the fact they were, because we were just talking about Simp had a .7
Mm-hmm.
something in that first series, and FaZe weren't able to win. Optic here, Shotzi has a similar statistical performance to that Simp dud we were talking about, and Optic are able to overcome that to get the win. So that is noteworthy in a sense, because we talk about Mercules having to be that MVP guy, or maybe not having to be, but when he is that MVP form, Optic have seemed pretty unbeatable so far this year. It's when we haven't gotten that from Mercules, the other guys have to be able to step up, and this is a case here where obviously if Mercules wasn't doing his thing and Shotzi's dropping a .76, we're probably talking about a G2 win. So I just think, you know, there are multiple takeaways from this game, and I think it's weird, and Optic fans might not want to look at it in the same way that I am, but the fact that Optic are able to get a reverse sweep win when Shotzi's dropping a .7 is good long term for Optic, in the sense of them knowing that they have what it takes to overcome a performance like that and still get the win. And then from a G2 standpoint, like, sucks to have a 2-0 lead against a team like Optic and not be able to close it out, but could have been worse, and they were able to, win two maps at the very least in terms of qualifier tiebreakers and whatnot.
Yeah, it's like a band-aid with the talent. Like, Shotzi has a bad map or series or whatever, but Mercules is able to kind of like, all right, like, I got you, bro. It's fine. And Dashi the same way. Hook had a incredible overload, drops 36. Like, that is the benefit of having all this talent, where G2 just simply does not have that. Like, they have talent, but just they are completely outmatched by Optic. And if Optic is kind of firing on all cylinders, you get back-to-back world championships like we've seen the last 2 years. And when they're not, it's like very up and down, like a pretty mysterious experience almost. Like, I've said it multiple times over the last few weeks. It's like, how are they losing? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, how are they getting beaten by clearly inferior teams? But that's how it goes. And But you see when Mercules is kind of doing his thing and Hook is able to do his thing, how they're able to beat a team that I think is really good. I think G2 is like a very solid, albeit flawed team. They've now gone to 2 Game 5s with Optic, and they could have beaten them both times, which is, I'm sure, very frustrating for them because those 2 wins could be very valuable. We saw last year the number of Game 5 losses that they had basically ended their regular season. They didn't get to champs because if they had maybe won 3 or 4 Game 5s, 3 more or 4 more Game 5s, they would have made it to champs over Boston or even Optic. And obviously that didn't happen, so they didn't make it to champs. But what you were saying about momentum, I think is right. That S&D where they're up 5-0, if they finish it out either 6-2 or better, then it's like a football team going to have like up 24-0, 24-3. But Optic was able to get a touchdown. It turned into like a 24-13 game, and Optic feels a lot more comfortable in that scenario. So they go into Game 3. They have a lot, like even when you lose a map 2, if you win 4 of the 5 last rounds in S&D, you certainly have more momentum in going into that Game 3 than G2 does, where they've lost 4 of the last 5 rounds in S&D. And that kind of proved itself on Overload. It was a pretty even hard point, pretty even S&D. And I think these two teams are pretty even in general when it comes out to like how well they played this season, which is very surprising to think about with G2 just in general. But it's a testament to kind of where they are in the season, where they've beaten FaZe multiple times and could have beaten Optic multiple times. I think they're going to be a pretty hard out for pretty much any team this season, regardless of where they are in the standings. Next up, so we already talked about Toronto and FaZe. We should talk about LAT though, because they make this big roster change. They drop Kenny. They replace him with Neum, who's coming in off the bench, making his CDL debut. Didn't really know anything to like what to expect of him because again, he had never played in the CDL. He's been pretty good in challengers. He was on the Huntsman roster, but at the same point, like the CDL is a different beast. We saw that with Lunars last year. He was very hyped up AR rookie coming into the season, or when he arrived in the CDL, and he just had a very flat and underwhelming performance throughout his rookie year. We've seen that multiple times with rookies, and it's unfortunate. I think he kind of held his own. Like he didn't have like the greatest showing or anything, but I think the most important thing for LAT specifically is that they won these matches. They win both against Vancouver, who we expect them, of course, to beat, and then they play Carolina, who they notably lost to in the qualifiers, the very last qualifier, if I'm not mistaken, of the Major 1 qualifiers, and then they played them in Major 2 and absolutely smoked them. So LAT get a 2-0 start to the Major 2 qualifiers. The Vancouver series was a little weird, I will admit. Like this was not exactly the performance you would expect of what we considered to be like a championship contending team before the season. And then obviously Vancouver has proved to be like one of the worst teams in the CDL, which we expected. But this was a very tight hard point. Vancouver certainly could have won that map 1. Vancouver does win map 2. They could have even won the Overload. This was a 7-5 Overload win for LAT. And then the Thieves close out like in really dominant fashion, the second hard point. What did you think of this performance with obviously Neum making his debut, but also LAT just having I'd say kind of an uneven showing against Vancouver?
I mean, certainly the map 1 in conjunction, like how close map 1 was, and then Vancouver winning the map 2, I was definitely like a little taken back by that and just like, okay, what's going on here? Um, but in the end, obviously LAT are able to, get the win, and they've had a lot of very high scoring overloads. So even like a 7-5 there is like, I've just seen multiple times this year now where LAT have scored a lot of points in overload. So I'm not, nothing major jumps out there, but I think overall for this series, even in the maps, even map 1 where obviously they won, but it was closer than anticipated. It was really like Scrap and Hydra, your two MVPs, were just they were the at the front and center of this for LAT the whole way. 40 from Scrap, 36 from Hydra in map 1. Highest number of kills from Surge in map 1 was Gwyn with 35. So even though um, LAT are able to narrowly win that map, and Vancouver were in a position to win it before LAT make a late surge,
Mm-hmm.
no pun intended. Um, Scrap and Hydra are still doing what you want to see from them. Where previously this year there have been points where it feels like Hydra hasn't been like MVP Hydra yet, and I'm it's still early, so I'm not like saying anything about that. But then, map 3, we get Hydra, 32 kills, Scrap 29, highest number of kills on Vancouver's Lunars with 28. Map 4, Scrap with 30, Hydra with 25, highest number of kills on Vancouver's 18 from Gwen and Abe. So it was kind of like those 3 map wins in particular. It was just like Scrap and Hydra are like, okay, we're these MVPs, we're these franchise players, quote unquote. We got to step up and do our thing. We got a young rookie making his debut. Let's not put too much pressure on his shoulder, even though it is against Vancouver, and let's go out and do our thing and get the dub. And that's not even mentioning Abizi here when we're talking about one of the best SMGs of all time. So I think that was the bigger takeaway for me, was like this was like maybe the first series all year where Scrap and Hydra were both like that all-star slash MVP caliber player in the same series at the same time. And maybe that's just because they were playing against a team that has less talent than them in Vancouver. But at the same time, for LAT fans, that's got to be good to see. Um, in terms of the Vancouver series too, just shout out TJ. He dropped chopsticks, 11 kills in the map too, and I think it was either like the ninth or 10th, or well, it only went 9 rounds, so maybe it was the 8th or 7th round of this S&D. He got an ace in like 10 or 12 seconds. So TJ was doing his thing in the S&D at least, but the slaying power from Scrap and Hydra was just too much for Vancouver to handle in the respawns.
And then LAT, they beat Carolina 3-0. This went to Game 5, Round 11 in the qualifiers. LAT notably swept them to start Major 1. This wasn't as dominant as it was on LAN, which obviously started a lot of stuff about, like, is Carolina an online team? But before this match, we saw Carolina beat Toronto. I don't know how much to really take away from that because Toronto has been god-awful. So I'm really kind of looking to you as like, what does this result say about either of these teams? Does it mean that LAT is better than they were, whatever it was, 3 weeks ago when they played Carolina online? Is Carolina worse than they were, or is the honeymoon period over? Is Toronto literally the worst team in the world? Like, what's going on here?
I mean, it's pretty hard to, you know, in this series in particular, LAT versus Carolina exceed at a .58 KD, and Lurks at a .7. Like, it's going to be very tough for
Yeah.
Carolina to beat anyone when those guys are struggling like that statistically, let alone a team like LAT. Honestly, the big thing for me, I was watching it when I was watching this matchup live today. I was like doing the notes here, and I realized like for map 1, all Abizi, Scrap, Nero, and Craze all had the 28 kills, which was the most for that map. And usually when I'm like typing this out for the notes, like I'm typing them all individually, and that's when I got to the fourth one. I was like, that's 4 guys with 28. I don't know how many times you see that where 4 people tie for the same exact amount of kills, and it's the most kills in a map. But then I took it that next step, and I see that Neum had over 2 minutes in the hill for LAT, and I don't know if that's going to be like something that just becomes what Neum does for this LAT themes. I don't know if that's something he's done historically throughout his career in challengers or whatnot. But maybe that's what this LAT team needs to succeed. If you think about it, Hydra, Scrap, and Abizi, like their slaying power, if Neum can just hold the hill and do his thing, like that seems like, at least in theory, that could be a recipe for success. And I know we even mentioned it like back when we were talking about the Kenny team with LAT, in terms of like Kenny's just got to sit in the hill and let the other three guys do their thing. And maybe that's like, maybe like the previous LAT team just didn't have somebody who wanted to, because you think about like some of Kenny's like, you know, best moments from his career, even going back to World War II when he was doing his thing with the PPSH. Like he had that one like insane play on Gibraltar in the hill, but a lot of the time Kenny wasn't like, you know, sitting in the hill with an SMG. He had Money Cheen and Lamar like holding down the hills, and he was just running around rampant. I don't know if this is like, I'm gonna have to keep an eye on it for LAT to see if this is something that continues to develop, but that could be worth noting and keeping an eye on going forward, is like maybe that's all Neum has to do on this team. And again, it's only his second CDL match, his first match. He didn't have to do anything more than he did because Scrap and Hydra were really popping off. And this map, he really didn't have to do anything crazy just because Carolina were struggling a little bit. But I mean, he still has a 1.29 KD, 53 and 41. It's the second highest KD for Thieves in this series. But the hill time, as somebody myself who enjoys collecting hill time, whenever I did play Call of Duty, um, it stood out to me, and I think it's going to be something that we want to keep an eye on as long as we're examining this LAT, um this iteration of LAT. Sorry.
Yeah, and to this point in the season, Kenny and Abizi had pretty much split as like the top OBJ guys in hardpoint. They were both
Okay.
averaging like 70-ish seconds, but Neum in these two matches had 86, which is obviously much higher than anybody else. So maybe it is just maybe staying alive as well. Like that's obviously kind of an underrated part of it. But like once you get in the hill, like if you just keep dying, like it doesn't really matter how many times you can get in it. It's just going to be like, you're just going to get wiped off the map. And I think that was kind of a big part of what was going on with Kenny to this point in the season. And we'll see what happens with Neum and playing a little bit tougher competition as they kind of move forward in the Major 2 qualifiers. But about as best of a start as you can expect from a team that has really struggled over the past few months. That, just getting 2 wins in a row online, especially against a team that they just lost to a few weeks ago. I think that's got to be chalked up as a success for LAT to this point with Neum. I think the only other match that we haven't talked about, right, is G2 versus C9. I think we've gone through all these other matches so far this week. So that's a good place to finish. That was the final match of the weekend, and it was a pretty quick series. It was 3-0 G2. Pretty much what you expect. Obviously, C9, like an hour after we got done with our last podcast, decided to just be absolute dickheads and announce their roster. So they confirmed the roster that we had been talking about. All Challengers players, all making their CDL debuts, which is exciting, I admit. But I think this was always going to be the result, was a loss in this series. We just talked about G2. They went to Game 5, Round 11 against the 2-time defending world champions. I think in general that team should be able to be a team of rookies in their debuts. But this was a pretty good performance, all things considered, for C9. 250, 215 hardpoint, 6-2 S&D, and then a 3-2 overload win for G2. I don't think there's really too much to say about G2, I would imagine, but what did you think of C9's new look roster in their first match?
Yeah. Quite frankly, I think this was. I mean, maybe it was me. I feel like the community as well has pretty low expectations for this C9 roster, but I think all things considered, this was a closer match than some people might have anticipated. I think I put it in our notes, and I'm not going to answer this question now, but it's something that I think is fair to look at given the community sentiment around the C9 roster. Um, if this Major 2 C9 lineup played against the all Saudi Falcons roster from the start of last year, who wins? And I'm not ready to, give an answer to that necessarily yet, but I think that's kind of where the bar has been set for uh, this C9 roster. It's just I feel like everyone has extremely low expectations for this squad. And the fact, yeah, it's a 3-0 loss, but S&D for a new team, we've talked about this even when it's not a team of four challengers players all making their CDL debut. S&D is something that newer squads always practice less, just
Mm-hmm.
given the way scrims work in Call of Duty and whatnot. So the fact that the most quote unquote lopsided match of this match was the S&D isn't unsurprising to me at all. The fact that the hard point was only a 35-point win and it's a 3-2 in the overload, like those two maps were a lot closer than I think a lot of people and myself were expecting. And maybe it's a case where when C9 plays like General Mates and LAT and Optic, they're getting 20-minute DoorDash. This obviously wasn't a super long series, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe the individual maps are bigger blowouts. But like G2, this is coming off with G2, the reverse sweep against, or being reverse swept by Optic in a series where they were hanging tooth and nail with a strong team in Optic. So you can view that as you want in terms of how to gauge the C9 roster versus the rest of the competition. But end of the day, I did think that this C9 squad, it is a 3-0 loss, and it is what it is in that sense. But I do think the individual maps outside of that S&D were closer than I expected, and probably closer than other people expected as well. I thought Nezra, for being the guy that I had heard the least amount about heading into the reports around this roster, him having like the most kills, or sorry, Encourage had 31 in the map one, Nezra had 30, but then Nezra had 32 in the map three, which was tied with Estriel for the most kills in that map three. Nezra was the guy I knew absolutely the least about. I knew that at least Okus and Encourage and Hyde were a part of the Stallions before that. I knew nothing about Nezra like at all. So the fact that he was the guy who kind of showed me a little something in this series when I knew absolutely nothing, I thought that was uh, a good sign for potentially what we can expect more of from Cloud9. But yeah, I think you know the way we're gonna have to look at this Cloud9 roster going forward, it feels like it's almost comparable to that all Saudi Falcons roster from last year, in the sense that it's a squad of four players who have not been in the CDL before, thrown into the fire to see what they can do. And obviously, that Falcons roster was a little different in the sense of it was four players that were from Saudi Arabia and not from NA or EU coming into the mix at the top level. Um, but nonetheless, I feel like it's at least somewhat comparable. Maybe that's just me. Um, but that's where my head's at right now with this C9 squad.
I can agree with that. I think maybe it's just me. I think that the C9 roster is more talented, but like just in total, I would imagine. But we have to see more of the C9 roster to really get a
Mm-hmm.
good view of it. Um, and we do know that Exnid is like he's turned out to be like a decent CDL player. Kicks, I think what we always thought was like he's
He
really
won the
talented, and
Challengers
yeah, and
event.
in challengers he's looked really good still. So I don't like he might be back in the CDL before we know it. Some of those other guys maybe not so much. Those they were struggling a bit. But yeah, I think it's similar in that the expectations are on the floor basically for the C9 roster. They won one match in between the Major 1 qualifiers and Major 1 with this veteran laden roster where you had a bunch of guys who had a bunch of matches under their belts, and that didn't really seem to matter. They came close to winning a lot of matches, but they didn't win very many. They only beat Vancouver, who had similarly only had one win during those qualifiers. So, I don't know what to really take from that. But yeah, C9 is probably in that position where the really what they should be hoping for is not like to compete for championships or to beat top teams necessarily. It's to qualify for Major 2, not to be in the bottom 2 of the
Yeah.
standings at the Major 1. And then at that point, you're like, okay, let's just try to get into the winner's bracket. Let's try to be one of those 8 teams that start in the winner's bracket. And like that's kind of where they should be basically every major from here on out is let's just make it to the winner's bracket. Like if we can get into the top 8, that is a major win for us. And let's not worry about anything else. I think it's very similar to, in that respect, to the Boston Breach after they obviously had that horrible season and Slasher gets benched and all that. The next season we were talking about like them making champs is a great thing. Like that's an awesome experience for them, and that's really all that matters. I think that we're talking about C9 and probably Vancouver in the same way. It's just like if you guys get top 8, like that's a good job. Like no shade or anything. Like you're on a different plane in terms of expectations than a lot of these other teams in the CDO. I think that does it, right? We're about an hour and a half in. That was the first week of the Major 2 qualifiers. Obviously, a lot of matches to get through. That is going to be a constant over the next several weeks as we go through 11 matches for each and every one of the CDL teams. So we're going to have a lot of matches every week, so you just get used to it. I'm going to go through the standings real quick. After week 1, at the top, we have a 3-way tie for first place with 2-0 records. LA Thieves, Optic Texas, and Paris Gentlemates. Then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams at 1-1, tied for fourth place. That's G2 Minnesota, Miami Heretics, Carolina Royal Ravens, FaZe Vegas, and the Boston Breach. And then there are 4 teams that are winless to start. We have 0-1 Vancouver, Cloud9, and Toronto. Just Vancouver and Cloud9 are 0-1, and then the Riyadh Falcons and Toronto Koi are both 0-2. The only 2 teams that did not win a map to start in week 1 of the Major 2 qualifiers were C9, who went 0-3, obviously, and then Toronto, we just talked about a bit ago now, they went 0-6. So we'll kind of keep track. Vancouver was the last team to win a map, I believe, this season. They did that when I think they beat Boston, if I'm not mistaken, and that match with TJ, I think, to either the first or
sweet.
Yeah. So we'll see if Toronto or C9 will be the last one to get their first map win of the qualifiers. Definitely not the teams that you necessarily might be expecting to be in that group at this point in the year. Pick'em, we are tied now. So you went 9-2 this week. I went 8-3. I had a 1 match advantage to this point. So we are both 46-25 through the first week of the Major 2 qualifiers. Tremor is still winless on the year. Please like, subscribe, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify. We are on YouTube and Twitch on the live stream. So if you want to tune in live and watch us, please do so on either of those platforms. We're closing in on 280 subscribers, I believe, on YouTube. You can also not only follow us on Twitch, but also subscribe. That's twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can do the same on Bink's Twitch, twitch.tv/jbink with 2Ks. You can also follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and the podcast stores at Ego Chall Podcast. Next show will probably be, I don't know, Wednesday. That's typically the day that we've settled on, but we will we'll do it when we want to do it and when we can do it, really. So the best way to kind of keep up with that is to follow and subscribe to the feeds. Whatever platform you prefer, that is the way you should do it. I always typically either on Apple Podcasts or YouTube. So either one that works for you, but Twitch also is a great way to just know when we go live. And I don't know if YouTube gives you like an email or whatever when people that you subscribe to go live for their streams, but maybe they do. But you can obviously find that out on your own. But we will be back sometime this week, probably to do power rankings, to talk about where we kind of think the teams are at this point in the season, and kind of leading into a long stretch for the Major 2 qualifiers. My voice is kind of sore now and kind of hoarse. We've been talking a lot over the last hour and a half, but that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys, as always, for all the support. I'm not anticipating any roster changes leading up to this next set of matches this weekend, but given the state of some of these teams, maybe they are uh, internally debating to be a little bit more proactive and make a move earlier in these qualifiers than later. So obviously that might be the only thing that changes what we're talking about outside of previewing Major Two Week Two qualifiers. But yeah, barring assuming no like crazy news or major roster moves happen over the next couple days, next episode should just be power rankings and our preview of the next week of Major Two qualifiers. But yeah, it's good to be back and good to have Call of Duty matches back again. And we're in the swing of things now. So season's heating up. Got plenty to talk about, and looking forward to going live again in a couple days and chatting with you guys and chatting with Preston and giving you all our thoughts on everything that's going on in the CDL. So yeah, I'm done yapping like Preston too. I'm good to go. So thank you guys as always, and remember to send the chow.